The first thing I did after inheriting my grandfather's ancient grimoire was accidentally spill demon blood all over the summoning circle in his basement. What I thought would be a complete disaster turned out to be the beginning of the most incredible adventure of my life. You see, I had no idea that my boring existence as a college dropout was about to transform into something straight out of the wildest anime fantasies. My name is Akira Tanaka, and up until 3 weeks ago, I was just another 20-year-old guy living in his grandmother's attic after dropping out of university. My parents had given up on me completely, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. I spent most of my days playing mobile games and watching anime, dreaming of a world where I could be the protagonist instead of just another background character in someone else's story. Everything changed when my eccentric grandfather passed away and left me his house. The old man had always been weird, muttering about ancient bloodlines and supernatural powers, but everyone just assumed he was going senile. When the lawyer handed me the keys to his creaky old mansion on the outskirts of town, I figured I'd just sell it and maybe have enough money to get my life back on track. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore the place first. The house was filled with dusty books, strange artifacts, and paintings of beautiful women in elaborate costumes. In the basement, I discovered something that made my heart race with excitement and terror. There was an entire ritual chamber down there, complete with intricate magic circles carved into the stone floor and shelves lined with bottles containing mysterious liquids. The centerpiece of the room was a massive leather-bound book sitting on an ornate pedestal. The cover was decorated with symbols I'd never seen before, and when I opened it, the pages seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. As I flipped through the ancient tome, I realized this wasn't just any old book. This was a genuine grimoire, filled with spells and incantations for summoning creatures from other dimensions. At first, I thought it had to be some elaborate prop, or maybe something my grandfather had commissioned for his eccentric hobby. But as I read deeper into the text, I started to notice patterns and details that seemed far too complex and consistent to be fake. The more I studied the grimoire, the more convinced I became that this might actually be real magic. The book contained detailed instructions for summoning various types of supernatural beings, but one section caught my attention more than any other. It was titled The Art of Companion Summoning and described how to call forth beautiful warrior maidens from parallel dimensions. According to the text, these summoned companions would be bound to serve their summoner with absolute loyalty and possess incredible combat abilities. My heart pounded as I read the requirements for the ritual. The spell called for rare ingredients, precise timing, and most importantly, a catalyst made from the blood of a high-ranking demon. Without this demon blood, the summoning would either fail completely or result in something far more dangerous than intended. I spent the next week searching through my grandfather's collection, hoping to find the demon blood mentioned in the grimoire. The basement was like a treasure trove of occult materials, with jars and vials containing substances I couldn't even begin to identify. Finally, hidden behind a false panel in an old cabinet, I found a small crystal vial filled with liquid that seemed to shimmer between deep red and pure black. The label on the vial was written in the same strange script as the grimoire, but I managed to translate it using the reference guide in the back of the book. It read, "Blood of the Crimson Duke. Handle with extreme caution." This was exactly what I needed for the summoning ritual, and I could barely contain my excitement as I prepared for what might be the most important night of my life. According to the instructions, the ritual had to be performed during the new moon when the barrier between dimensions was at its weakest. I had to wait another 5 days, which felt like an eternity. During that time, I memorized every word of the incantation and practiced drawing the summoning circles until I could do it perfectly with my eyes closed. The night of the new moon finally arrived, and I descended into the basement with trembling hands and a racing heart. I lit the candles around the ritual chamber exactly as described in the grimoire, and began carefully drawing the summoning circle with chalk made from ground bones and silver dust. Every line had to be perfect, every symbol precisely placed, or the entire ritual could backfire catastrophically. As I worked, I couldn't help but think about all the anime I'd watched where ordinary guys suddenly found themselves surrounded by beautiful and powerful companions. The idea that I might actually be able to experience something like that in real life seemed too good to be true, but I was willing to risk everything for the chance. When the circle was complete, I placed the crystal vial of demon blood at the center and began reciting the ancient incantation. The words felt strange on my tongue, like they were meant to be spoken by someone far more powerful than me. As I chanted, the candles around the room began to flicker, and I could feel an electric tension building in the air. The grimoire had warned that the ritual would require a significant amount of the summoner's own life force, but I was prepared for that. What I wasn't prepared for was the sudden surge of power that erupted from the circle when I reached the climax of the incantation. The demon blood began to glow with an intense crimson light, and the entire basement filled with an otherworldly energy that made my skin tingle. Just as I spoke the final words of the summoning spell, disaster struck. The ancient floorboards beneath my feet gave way slightly, causing me to stumble forward. My elbow knocked into the crystal vial, sending it flying across the circle. Instead of the demon blood landing in the precise center where it was supposed to activate the summoning matrix, it splattered across multiple points on the intricate pattern. The moment the demon blood made contact with the circle, everything went completely insane. The magical symbols began burning with different colored flames, and the air itself seemed to tear apart like fabric. Instead of the controlled summoning I had planned, I had apparently triggered something much more chaotic and unpredictable. Brilliant flashes of light erupted from every point where the demon blood had landed, and I could hear what sounded like multiple dimensional barriers shattering simultaneously. The grimoire had mentioned that botched summoning rituals could have unexpected consequences, but nothing had prepared me for what happened next. Through the swirling vortexes of light and energy, I began to see silhouettes materializing in the air above the circle. At first, there was just one figure, then two, then three, and the numbers kept multiplying. Each flash of light seemed to bring another presence into our dimension, and I realized with a mixture of terror and excitement that my mistake had caused the spell to summon not just one companion, but an entire army. The first Jed from Moonlight itself. She landed gracefully in the center of the circle figure to fully materialize was a stunning warrior woman with flowing silver hair and armor that seemed to be four, her piercing blue eyes immediately locking onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. Before I could even process what was happening, more figures began appearing all around the basement. A fierce-looking archer with crimson hair materialized near the eastern wall, her bow already drawn and ready for battle. Next came a mysterious mage in dark robes, her staff crackling with purple lightning that illuminated her beautiful but dangerous features. The summoning continued as more and more incredible women appeared, each one more breathtaking and powerful looking than the last. There was a knight in gleaming golden armor, a ninja dressed in form-fitting black leather, a sorceress whose very presence made the air shimmer with magical energy, and at least a dozen others. Each of them possessed an otherworldly beauty that seemed almost too perfect to be real, and their eyes all held the same strange combination of loyalty and predatory intelligence. As the dimensional rifts finally began to close and the chaotic energy settled, I found myself standing in a basement full of the most incredible women I had ever seen. They were all staring at me with expressions that ranged from curious to amused to slightly concerned, and I realized that according to the laws of the summoning spell, they were all bound to serve me as their master. The silver-haired warrior who had appeared first stepped forward and knelt before me, her voice carrying an accent that sounded like it came from a fantasy kingdom. She spoke with perfect clarity despite the otherworldly nature of her origins, explaining that she was Commander Seraphina of the Celestial Guard, and that she and her sisters had answered my summons to serve in whatever capacity I required. As Commander Seraphina introduced herself, I could barely form coherent thoughts. Here I was, surrounded by an army of supernatural beauties, who apparently considered me their master, and all I could do was stand there with my mouth hanging open like some kind of anime protagonist who just walked into the girls' locker room by accident. The crimson-haired archer stepped forward next, her bow still at the ready but pointed safely toward the ceiling. She had fierce green eyes that seemed to see right through me, and when she spoke, her voice carried the confidence of someone who'd never missed a target in her life. She introduced herself as Captain Lyra of the Emberwind Rangers, explaining that she specialized in long-range combat and tactical reconnaissance. The dark-robed mage glided forward with movements so fluid they seemed supernatural. Her staff continued to crackle with purple energy, and I noticed that shadows seemed to bend and twist around her feet as she moved. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried an undertone of barely contained power. She called herself Mistress Nyx of the Void Court, and mentioned something about being skilled in both offensive and defensive magical arts. One by one, each of the summoned warriors introduced herself, and I quickly realized that my accidental mass summoning had brought together representatives from dozens of different supernatural realms. There was Captain Arya, a golden-armored paladin whose very presence seemed to make the basement brighter. The ninja introduced herself as Shadow Master Kira, and I swear she vanished and reappeared 3 times during her introduction just to show off. There was Sage Elena, whose magical aura made the air around her shimmer like heat waves, and Berserker Queen Freya, whose massive battle axe looked like it could cleave a building in half. Each warrior possessed unique abilities and came from a different dimensional realm, but they all shared one thing in common. According to the binding spell that had brought them here, they were all completely and utterly loyal to me. The implications of this situation were staggering. Not only had I accidentally summoned an army of incredibly powerful supernatural warriors, but I was apparently now responsible for all of them. The grimoire had mentioned that summoned companions required regular infusions of magical energy from their summoner to maintain their presence in this dimension, and I had no idea if I possessed enough power to sustain so many beings. Commander Seraphina seemed to sense my confusion and concern. She explained that the demon blood I had used as a catalyst was far more potent than typical summoning materials, and that the chaotic nature of the ritual had created a unique bond between me and all of the summoned warriors. Instead of the usual master-servant relationship described in the grimoire, we had formed something more like a supernatural military unit with me as the commanding officer. This revelation should have been terrifying, but instead, I felt a surge of excitement unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just some loser watching other people have adventures. I was the protagonist of my own incredible story, surrounded by loyal companions who possessed abilities beyond anything I could have imagined. The practical implications of the situation began to sink in as I looked around at my new army. Where was I supposed to house nearly 20 supernatural warriors? How was I going to explain their presence if anyone else showed up at the house? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do with an army of incredibly powerful and beautiful women who were all looking to me for leadership? Captain Lyra seemed to read my thoughts and stepped forward with a reassuring smile. She explained that as summoned beings, they didn't require the same basic necessities as humans. They could sustain themselves through the magical energy of our bond, and they possessed the ability to make themselves invisible to ordinary people when necessary. This meant they could remain hidden while I figured out what to do next. Mistress Nyx added that their arrival in this dimension had not gone unnoticed by other supernatural entities. The massive amount of magical energy released during the summoning ritual had created ripples throughout the dimensional barriers, and it was likely that other powerful beings would soon come investigating. She suggested that we use this time to prepare for potential threats and establish a proper base of operations. The golden-armored paladin Arya stepped forward and knelt beside Seraphina, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to military command. She proposed that they conduct a full assessment of the house and surrounding area, establishing defensive positions and escape routes in case we came under attack. The idea that we might need to defend ourselves hadn't occurred to me, But I was quickly learning that summoning supernatural beings came with complications I hadn't anticipated. Shadow Master Kira materialized directly beside me, appearing so suddenly that I nearly jumped out of my skin. She whispered that she had already conducted a preliminary reconnaissance of the property and detected several potential security vulnerabilities. Her ninja training had apparently kicked in the moment she arrived, and she was ready to implement a comprehensive protection plan for our new headquarters. As I listened to my newly summoned army discuss tactical preparations and defensive strategies, I realized that my quiet life of playing mobile games and watching anime was officially over. Whether I was ready or not, I had become the leader of a supernatural military unit, and the responsibilities that came with that role were both thrilling and terrifying. Berserker Queen. Freya hefted her massive battle axe and grinned with an expression that suggested she was hoping for a fight. She mentioned that it had been far too long since she'd had a proper battle, and the prospect of defending her new master against supernatural threats filled her with excitement. The casual way she discussed potential combat made me realize that violence was probably going to become a regular part of my life. Sage Elena approached with her staff glowing softly, explaining that she had detected residual magical energies throughout the house that suggested my grandfather had been far more powerful than I had realized. She believed there might be additional magical resources hidden throughout the property that could help us prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. The idea that my eccentric grandfather had been keeping even more secrets was both intriguing and slightly disturbing. Commander Serafina stood and addressed the entire group, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone born to lead. She announced that they would divide into specialized teams to handle different aspects of our situation. Some would focus on fortifying our defenses, others would search for additional magical resources, and a few would venture out to gather intelligence about potential threats in the area. The efficiency and professionalism with which they organized themselves was impressive and slightly intimidating. These weren't just beautiful women with supernatural powers. They were experienced warriors who had fought in battles across multiple dimensions, and they were now applying that expertise to protecting me and our new base of operations. As I watched them split into teams and begin their various tasks, I couldn't help but marvel at how dramatically my life had changed in just a few hours. This morning, I had been a college dropout with no prospects and no purpose. Tonight, I was the commanding officer of a supernatural army that looked like it had stepped out of the most elaborate anime fantasy ever created. The reality of my situation was slowly beginning to sink in, and with it came a mixture of excitement and responsibility that I had never experienced before. These incredible warriors were depending on me for leadership, and I had no idea if I was capable of living up to their expectations. But as I looked around at their determined faces and felt the bond of loyalty that connected us, I knew there was no turning back now. My journey into a world of magic, danger, and adventure had officially begun, and I was determined to prove worthy of the trust these amazing women had placed in me. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together as a team, and maybe, just maybe, I would finally become the hero I had always dreamed of being. The first major test of our newfound partnership came sooner than any of us expected. I had barely finished processing the fact that I now commanded an army of supernatural warriors when Mistress Nyx suddenly stiffened, her purple eyes glowing with an otherworldly light as she sensed something approaching through the dimensional barriers. She turned to me with an expression of urgent concern, explaining that the massive energy signature from our summoning ritual had attracted the attention of something called a Void Stalker. According to her knowledge of interdimensional threats, these creatures were drawn to large concentrations of magical power like moths to a flame, and they had an unfortunate tendency to devour anything they encountered. Commander Serafina immediately took charge of the situation, her military training kicking in as she began issuing orders to the other warriors. Captain Lyra positioned herself near the basement windows with her bow ready, while Shadow Master Kira simply vanished into the shadows to conduct reconnaissance. The golden-armored paladin Arya began chanting something under her breath, causing her armor to glow with protective energy. I felt completely useless standing there while these incredible women prepared for battle on my behalf. The grimoire had mentioned that summoned companions drew power from their master's life force, but it hadn't included an instruction manual on how to actually command. I could do was try to stage supernatural warriors in combat, all out of their way, and hope that my accidental army knew what they were doing. Sage Elena approached me with her glowing staff, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder, as she explained that as their summoner, I possessed the to enhance their combat abilities by channeling magical energy through our bond. She guided me through a simple meditation technique that would allow me to sense the connection between us and direct power where it was needed most. The moment I closed my eyes and focused on the bond, I could suddenly feel all of them like points of light in my consciousness. Each warrior had a distinct magical signature, and I could sense their emotions, their readiness for battle, and their unwavering loyalty to me. It was an incredible sensation that made me feel more connected to other beings than I ever had before in my life. Berserker Queen Freya let out a battle cry that shook the entire house as she detected the approaching threat. Through the windows, I could see something massive moving through the darkness outside, its form seeming to bend and twist reality around it as it approached our location. The Voidstalker looked like a living shadow with too many eyes and claws that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Captain Lyra drew her bow and released an arrow that blazed with crimson fire as it flew through the night air. The projectile struck the creature center mass, causing it to let out a shriek that sounded like metal being torn apart. However, instead of falling, the Voidstalker seemed to absorb the magical energy from the attack, growing larger and more solid as it fed on the power. Mistress Nyx cursed in a language I didn't recognize, explaining that Voidstalkers were notoriously difficult to kill because they could consume magical attacks and use that energy to strengthen themselves. Traditional combat spells would only make the creature more dangerous, which meant we needed to find alternative methods of dealing with the threat. Shadow Master. Kira materialized beside me, her voice barely above a whisper as she reported that the creature had already begun draining the magical energy from the protective wards around the property. If we didn't act quickly, it would grow powerful enough to tear through our defenses and potentially devour everyone in the house, including me. Commander Seraphina made a tactical decision that demonstrated why she had earned her leadership position. Instead of engaging the Voidstalker directly, she ordered the team to create a containment barrier that would trap the creature while slowly draining its absorbed energy back into the environment. It was a risky strategy that required precise coordination between multiple warriors. I watched in amazement as my summoned army worked together with the efficiency of a unit that had been training together for years. Arya and Elena combined their magical abilities to create a shimmering dome of golden light around the Voidstalker, while Nyx used her void magic to create a counter-drain effect that began pulling energy away from the creature. The battle was unlike anything I had ever imagined possible. These weren't just pretty faces with magical powers. They were seasoned warriors who understood combat tactics and interdimensional threats in ways that made my head spin. Each of them played a crucial role in the containment strategy, and their coordination was absolutely flawless. As the containment barrier took effect, I could feel the drain on my own life force as the warriors drew power through our bond to maintain their spells. The sensation was exhausting, but strangely exhilarating at the same time. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was part of something important, contributing to an effort that actually mattered. The Voidstalker thrashed against its magical prison, its multiple eyes focusing on me with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Through our bond, Mistress Nyx explained that the creature could sense that I was the source of the warrior's power, and it was trying to break through the barrier to reach me directly. If it succeeded, the resulting feeding frenzy would likely kill me and banish all of the summoned warriors back to their home dimensions. Berserker Queen Freya charged forward with her massive battle axe, but instead of attacking the creature directly, she began carving intricate symbols into the ground around the containment barrier. Her berserker rage was apparently more strategic than it appeared, as she was creating a runic amplification circle that would strengthen the magical prison. Captain Lyra switched from her regular arrows to special projectiles that she called void piercers, designed specifically for dealing with interdimensional entities. These arrows didn't carry magical energy that the creature could absorb, but instead created small tears in reality that disrupted the Void Stalkers to maintain its physical form in our dimension. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Through our bond, I could sense the determination and skill of each warrior as they executed their parts of the containment strategy. Despite the danger of the situation, I felt a surge of pride watching them work together to protect not just me, but potentially the entire neighborhood from this interdimensional threat. Sage, Elena approached me during a lull in the battle, explaining that the Void Stalker's presence indicated that our summoning ritual had created a permanent weakness in the dimensional barriers around the house. This meant that other creatures would likely be drawn to our location in the future, and we needed to establish more permanent defensive measures. The implications of her warning were sobering. My accidental mass summoning hadn't just brought me an army of loyal companions. It had apparently turned my grandfather's house into a beacon for every dangerous entity in the interdimensional neighborhood. The quiet life I had been living was not only over, but it had been replaced by something far more dangerous and complicated than I could have imagined. Commander Serafina called for a final coordinated assault on the weakening Void Stalker. All of the warriors synchronized their attacks, creating a feedback loop in the containment barrier that began forcing the creature back through the dimensional rift it had used to reach our world. The process was visually spectacular, with lights and energy crackling through the air like a supernatural fireworks display. As the Void Stalker was finally banished back to whatever realm it had come from, the containment barrier collapsed, leaving all of us exhausted but victorious. The warriors had successfully defended our new headquarters from its first major threat, and I had managed to provide enough magical energy through our bond to support their efforts without passing out completely. The aftermath of the battle left me with a new understanding of what my life had become. This wasn't just a fantasy come to life. It was a serious responsibility that came with real dangers and consequences. The women I had summoned weren't just beautiful companions. They were professional warriors who had risked their existence to protect me from a threat I couldn't have handled alone. Captain Lyra reported that her reconnaissance had detected additional weak points in the dimensional barriers around the property, suggesting that more creatures would likely attempt to breach our defenses in the coming days. The house that had seemed like a perfect retreat was apparently sitting on what amounted to a supernatural highway, making it both strategically valuable and extremely dangerous. Mistress Nyx began explaining the various types of interdimensional entities that might be attracted to our location, from relatively harmless curiosity seekers to world-ending catastrophes that could tear holes in reality itself. Her knowledge of these threats was both impressive and terrifying, making me realize just how unprepared I was for the responsibilities that had fallen into my lap. Shadowmaster Kira emerged from the shadows with a detailed report on the security vulnerabilities she had identified around the property. Her ninja training had apparently included extensive study of defensive architecture, and she had already developed plans for fortifying the house against future attacks. The level of professional expertise these women brought to our situation was both reassuring and slightly overwhelming. Berserker Queen Freya was practically glowing with satisfaction after the battle, explaining that it had been months since she'd had a proper fight worthy of her abilities. Her enthusiasm for combat was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to future battles despite the obvious dangers involved. There was something deeply satisfying about being part of a team that could face supernatural threats and emerge victorious. Sage Elena began cataloging the magical resources we had expended during the battle, calculating how long it would take for everyone to recover their full strength. Her scholarly approach to combat magic was fascinating, and I realized that having someone who understood the theoretical aspects of our abilities would be crucial for long-term success. The golden-armored paladin Arya approached me with a concerned expression, explaining that the Void Stalker's attack had been unusually aggressive for a creature that was merely attracted to magical energy. She suspected that something else might have directed it to our location, possibly another entity that wanted to test our defenses or eliminate us as a potential threat. Her suggestion that we might have enemies we didn't even know about was deeply unsettling. I had been so focused on the excitement of having summoned an army of supernatural companions that I hadn't considered the possibility that other powerful beings might view us as a threat to be eliminated. The magical world was apparently much more political and dangerous than the grimoire had suggested. Commander Seraphina gathered all of the warriors for a post-battle debriefing, analyzing what had worked well during the fight and identifying areas where our coordination could be improved. Her military professionalism was impressive, and I could see why she had been chosen to lead the Celestial Guard in whatever realm she had come from. As I listened to their tactical discussion, I realized that my role as their summoner was going to require a lot more than just providing magical energy through our bond. These were experienced warriors who deserved competent leadership, and I was going to need to learn how to be the commander they needed me to be. The night's events had transformed my understanding of what I had gotten myself into. This wasn't just a fantasy adventure where everything would work out perfectly. It was a complex situation with real stakes and serious consequences. But as I looked around at the determined faces of my summoned companions, I felt more motivated than I ever had before to rise to the challenge and become worthy of their loyalty and trust. The week following our first battle brought a routine I never could have imagined when I was just another college dropout wasting away in my grandmother's attic. Every morning began with Commander Seraphina conducting training exercises in the basement, her silver hair catching the candlelight as she drilled the other warriors on combat formations and tactical maneuvers. The sound of clashing weapons and shouted commands had become my new alarm clock, and I found myself looking forward to these sessions more than I ever had to anything in my old life. Captain Lyra had taken it upon herself to teach me basic archery skills, insisting that even though I could channel magical energy to enhance their abilities, I needed to be capable of defending myself in situations where our bond might be disrupted. Her patience with my clumsy attempts to draw her massive bow was remarkable, especially considering that her usual targets were interdimensional threats rather than empty bottles lined up against the basement wall. Mistress Nix had begun instructing me in the theoretical aspects of dimensional magic, explaining how the barriers between worlds functioned and what kinds of entities were most likely to be drawn to our location. Her lessons were fascinating but exhausting, requiring me to memorize complex diagrams and incantations that made my head spin. The purple lightning that constantly crackled around her staff served as a constant reminder of the power she wielded so casually. Shadow Master Kira had disappeared for 3 entire days to scout the surrounding area, returning with detailed maps of every building, road, and potential escape route within a 10-mile radius of the house. Her reconnaissance had revealed several other locations with significant magical energy signatures, suggesting that my grandfather's property wasn't the only supernatural hotspot in the region. The golden-armored paladin Arya had appointed herself as my personal bodyguard, following me everywhere with her hand resting casually on the pommel of her blessed sword. Her protective instincts were touching, but sometimes overwhelming, especially when she insisted on accompanying me to the grocery store and spent the entire trip scanning for potential threats among the produce aisles. Berserker Queen Freya had claimed the backyard as her personal training ground, where she practiced increasingly elaborate combat techniques that left craters in the lawn and occasionally shattered windows in neighboring houses. Her enthusiasm for destruction was matched only by her skill at repairing the damage afterward, though I suspected she enjoyed the demolition phase considerably more than the reconstruction. Sage Elena had transformed my grandfather's study into a magical laboratory, where she conducted experiments on the various artifacts and ingredients we'd discovered throughout the house. Her research had revealed that the old man had been collecting supernatural materials for decades, assembling what amounted to one of the most comprehensive magical arsenals outside of the major dimensional courts. The other warriors had settled into their own routines as well, each finding ways to contribute to our growing understanding of the situation we'd found ourselves in. The house that had once felt empty and lifeless now hummed with activity and purpose, filled with voices speaking in languages I was still learning to understand, and the constant background hum of magical energy being channeled for various projects. My own transformation had been just as dramatic as the physical changes to the property. The bond I shared with the warriors had begun affecting me in ways I hadn't expected, gradually enhancing my physical capabilities and magical sensitivity. I could now sense supernatural presences from much greater distances, and my reflexes had improved to the point where I could actually keep up with some of their training exercises. The most significant change, however, was in how I saw myself and my place in the world. For the first time in my life, I woke up each morning with a sense of purpose and responsibility that went beyond my own immediate needs. These incredible women were depending on me not just for magical energy, but for leadership and direction in a world that was often hostile to their very existence. 3 days after the Voidstalker incident, our peaceful routine was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. I was in the kitchen attempting to prepare breakfast for everyone when Shadow Master Kira materialized beside me, her usual silent approach replaced by an urgency that immediately put me on alert. She reported that a lone figure had appeared at the edge of our property, standing just outside the defensive perimeters we'd established, but making no attempt to approach the house. The individual appeared to be female, dressed in elaborate robes that seemed to shift and change color depending on the angle of observation. Most concerning was the fact that she radiated magical energy on a scale that rivaled our entire group combined. Commander Serafina arrived in the kitchen before Kira had finished her report, having sensed the same disturbance through her own magical awareness. Her expression was grim as she explained that entities of such power rarely traveled alone, and the visitor's decision to announce her presence rather than attack immediately suggested either diplomatic intentions or supreme confidence in her ability to handle whatever resistance we might offer. Within minutes, all of the warriors had assembled in the main hall, their weapons ready, but not drawn in a display of controlled readiness that spoke volumes about their military discipline. Through the front windows, we could see the mysterious figure standing motionless in the morning mist, her presence creating visible distortions in the air around her. Mistress Nick studied the visitor through a scrying crystal she'd produced from somewhere in her dark robes, her purple eyes narrowing as she analyzed the magical signatures surrounding the unknown woman. After several tense minutes, she announced that the visitor appeared to be some form of dimensional administrator, possibly someone sent by one of the major supernatural courts to investigate our recent activities. The implications of this revelation were immediately clear to everyone in the room. If the major powers in the supernatural community had taken notice of our activities, it meant that our little group was no longer operating in the shadows. We were now players on a much larger stage, with all the opportunities and dangers that such recognition entailed. Captain Lyra positioned herself at a window where she could maintain a clear shot at the visitor while remaining out of sight, her bow strung and ready despite the diplomatic nature of the encounter. Her tactical thinking impressed me once again, as she'd chosen a position that would allow her to provide cover fire while still giving the rest of us room to maneuver if negotiations went badly. Sage Elena approached with an ancient tome she'd retrieved from my grandfather's collection, explaining that it contained protocols for dealing with emissaries from the dimensional courts. According to the text, refusing to acknowledge such a visitor could be interpreted as an act of hostility, while appearing too eager to meet could suggest weakness or desperation. The golden-armored paladin Arya stepped forward to volunteer as our primary negotiator, her natural charisma and diplomatic training making her the obvious choice for such a delicate situation. Her suggestion that I remain hidden during the initial contact was both tactically sound and personally frustrating, as I wanted to be directly involved in anything's future. That might affect our group berserker. Queen Freya was practically vibrating with contained energy, her battle instincts clearly telling her to charge outside and demand answers from the mysterious visitor. Her restraint in deferring to Seraphina's tactical judgment demonstrated a level of discipline that belied her berserker classification, though I could see the effort it was costing her to remain still. Shadowmaster Kira volunteered to position herself outside the house where she could observe the meeting from concealment, ready to intervene if the visitor proved hostile or if additional threats approached during the negotiations. Her ninja training made her the perfect choice for such a mission, and I felt more confident knowing she would be watching over the proceedings. Commander Serafina made the final decision about how to handle the situation, choosing a measured approach that balanced caution with the diplomatic courtesy required when dealing with representatives of the major supernatural powers. Her plan called for Arya to approach the visitor alone while the rest of us remained ready to provide support if the situation deteriorated. As Arya prepared to leave the house, I felt the familiar sensation of our bond activating as she drew upon my magical energy to enhance her diplomatic abilities. The experience was becoming more natural with practice, though I still marveled at the way I could sense her emotions and intentions through the connection we shared. The golden-armored paladin stepped outside with the grace and confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations, her blessed armor gleaming in the morning sunlight as she approached the mysterious visitor. Through the windows, we watched as the two figures began what appeared to be a formal conversation, complete with elaborate gestures and ritualized movements. The waiting was almost unbearable as we observed the diplomatic exchange without being able to hear what was being discussed. Every gesture and expression was analyzed for signs of hostility or agreement, while Mistress Nyx provided running commentary on the magical energies she could detect flowing between the two participants. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Arya began walking back toward the house, her measured pace suggesting that the meeting had concluded successfully. The mysterious visitor remained in place, watching our paladins retreat with an expression that was impossible to read from such a distance. When Arya entered the house, her expression was a mixture of relief and concern that immediately put everyone on edge. She reported that the visitor was indeed an emissary from one of the major dimensional courts, specifically the Twilight Conclave, which apparently served as a sort of supernatural United Nations for entities that existed between dimensions. The emissary had come to investigate the massive dimensional disruption caused by our summoning ritual, not to threaten us, but to determine whether we represented a danger to the stability of the interdimensional barriers. According to Arya, our activities had created ripple effects that were being felt across multiple realms, attracting the attention of powers we couldn't even begin to imagine. More importantly, the emissary had extended an invitation for me to appear before the Twilight Conclave to explain our actions and intentions. This was apparently a significant honor, as most dimensional newcomers were simply monitored from a distance rather than being invited to participate in official proceedings. The invitation came with both opportunities and risks that would require careful consideration. Accepting would legitimize our group in the eyes of the supernatural community and potentially provide access to resources and protection we desperately needed. However, it would also mean subjecting ourselves to scrutiny and possible restrictions from entities whose motivations and methods remained completely unknown to us. Mistress Nyx explained that the Twilight Conclave had a reputation for being relatively fair in their dealings with newcomers, but their definition of fairness might not align with human concepts of justice or autonomy. Many groups that had appeared before the conclave had emerged with their activities strictly regulated, or had been forced to relocate to dimensions where they would pose less risk to the established order. The emissary had provided a token that would allow us to contact the conclave when we were ready to respond to their invitation, but had also made it clear that ignoring the summons indefinitely would be interpreted as a hostile act. We had perhaps a week to decide how to proceed before our silence would force them to take more direct action. Commander Serafina called for an immediate strategy session to discuss our options, her military training recognizing that this diplomatic contact represented a crucial turning point in our development as a supernatural organization. The decisions we made in the next few days would likely determine whether we continued to operate as an independent group or found ourselves absorbed into the larger supernatural community. As we gathered around the dining room table to begin our discussions, I realized that my journey from college dropout to supernatural commander was about to enter an entirely new phase. The quiet days of learning and preparation were over, and we were now facing challenges that would test not just our combat abilities, but our diplomatic skills and strategic thinking. The weight of responsibility I felt as I looked around at my loyal companions was both exhilarating and terrifying. These incredible women had placed their trust in me, and the choices I made in the coming days would affect not just my own future, but theirs as well. Whatever happened next, we would face it together as a team. But the ultimate burden of leadership rested squarely on my shoulders. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I had ever been part of. As seasoned warriors from multiple dimensions shared their knowledge and experience to help us navigate this unprecedented situation. Each of them brought unique perspectives and insights that gradually shaped our understanding of the opportunities and dangers we were facing. Captain Lyra argued for a cautious approach, suggesting that we needed more information about the Twilight Conclave before committing to any course of action. Her ranger training emphasized the importance of thorough reconnaissance before engaging with unknown entities, and she volunteered to use her tracking skills to gather intelligence about other groups that had dealt with the Conclave in the past. Berserker Queen Freya took a more aggressive stance, proposing that we should appear before the Conclave as equals rather than supplicants seeking permission to exist. Her warrior culture valued strength and direct action over diplomacy and compromise, and she believed that showing weakness at this critical juncture would invite further interference in our affairs. The debate continued for hours as we explored every possible angle and consequence of our potential responses to the Conclave's invitation. The complexity of interdimensional politics was staggering, with alliances and rivalries that stretched across multiple realms and involved entities whose motivations were often incomprehensible to human minds. As the discussion progressed, I began to understand that this decision would define not just our immediate future, but the fundamental nature of what our group would become. We could choose the path of integration, working within the established supernatural order to build legitimacy and security. Alternatively, we could maintain our independence at the cost of potential isolation and conflict with powers far greater than ourselves. The choice before us was simultaneously the most important and most uncertain decision I had ever faced, and I knew that whatever path we chose, there would be no turning back once we committed to our course of action. The adventure that had begun with a simple mistake in a basement summoning circle was about to become something far more complex and consequential than I had ever imagined possible. The morning after our strategy session, I woke to find Sage Elena standing beside my bed with an expression of barely contained excitement. In her hands, she held what appeared to be a crystalline communication device that pulsed with soft blue light, and her scholarly demeanor was practically vibrating with discovery. She explained that her research into my grandfather's collection had revealed something extraordinary, a direct communication link to the Archive Eternal, a vast interdimensional library that contained knowledge from across countless realms. According to Elena's findings, my grandfather hadn't just been a casual collector of supernatural artifacts. He had been a registered scholar of the Archive, with full access to their research facilities and consultation services. The crystal device she held was his personal access key, and more importantly, it was still active despite his death. This meant that I had inherited not just his magical materials, but his scholarly credentials within the supernatural academic community. The implications were staggering. The Archive Eternal was supposedly neutral ground where entities from all dimensions could access information without political interference. If we could establish contact with their researchers, we might be able to learn everything we needed to know about the Twilight Conclave before making our decision about their invitation. Commander Serafina was immediately interested in this development, recognizing the strategic value of intelligence gathering before entering negotiations with unknown entities. Her military experience had taught her that information was often more valuable than weapons when dealing with superior forces, and she gave Elena permission to attempt contact with the archive. The communication process was fascinating to observe. Elena placed the crystal device in the center of a magic circle she'd drawn using silver dust and pulverized moonstone, then began chanting in a language that seemed to shift and change even as she spoke it. The crystal began to glow brighter, and gradually, a three-dimensional image began forming in the air above it. The figure that materialized was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It appeared to be humanoid, but was composed entirely of what looked like flowing text in dozens of different scripts and languages. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of vast knowledge and infinite patience, introducing itself as Librarian Codex 17 of the Archives Reference Division. Elena presented our situation with scholarly precision, explaining the circumstances of the mass summoning, our encounter with the Void Stalker, and the recent contact from the Twilight Conclave emissary. The librarian listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated an understanding of interdimensional politics that made my head spin. When Elena finished her report, Librarian Codex 17 was silent for several long moments, apparently consulting vast databases of information that existed somewhere beyond our dimension. Finally, it began to speak, and what it told us changed our entire understanding of our situation. The massive dimensional disruption caused by our summoning ritual hadn't just attracted random attention from the supernatural community. It had triggered an ancient early warning system that monitored for potential reality-threatening events. The Twilight Conclave's interest in us wasn't purely investigative. They were responding to automated alerts that classified our activities as a potential existential threat to dimensional stability. This revelation was both terrifying and enlightening. We weren't just a curiosity that had caught the attention of interdimensional authorities. We were perceived as a genuine danger that required immediate evaluation and possible containment. The polite invitation to appear before the Conclave was likely their preferred alternative to more direct intervention methods. Librarian Codex 17 continued its briefing, explaining that the specific combination of demon blood catalyst and chaotic summoning pattern we had accidentally created was similar to techniques used by several historical entities that had caused major dimensional catastrophes. The Conclave's concern was that we might be attempting to recreate those disasters, either intentionally or through ignorance of the forces we were manipulating. The librarian provided detailed historical examples of similar situations, describing groups that had made first contact with the supernatural community under comparable circumstances. Some had successfully integrated into the interdimensional order and gone on to become respected members of the supernatural community. Others had been deemed too dangerous to exist and had been eliminated or banished to uninhabitable dimensions. Shadow Master Kira materialized from the shadows with a question that demonstrated her ninja training in intelligence analysis. She asked about the specific criteria the Conclave used to evaluate potentially dangerous groups, seeking to understand what factors might influence their decision about our fate. The librarian's response was both helpful and ominous. The Conclave primarily evaluated three factors when dealing with dimensional newcomers: the level of threat they pose to interdimensional stability, their willingness to accept supervision and regulation, and their potential value as allies or resources. Groups that scored poorly in the first two categories while showing high potential in the third were often subjected to forced recruitment or absorption into existing supernatural organizations. Mistress Nix asked about the legal precedents governing such evaluations, her void magic giving her insight into the darker aspects of interdimensional law. The librarian explained that the Conclave operated under ancient treaties that granted them broad authority to maintain dimensional stability by any means necessary. Individual rights and sovereignty were secondary considerations when reality itself might be at risk. Captain Lyra inquired about escape routes and alternatives to appearing before the Conclave, her ranger instinct seeking options that might allow us to avoid the confrontation entirely. Unfortunately, The librarian informed us that the Conclave had tracking capabilities that made hiding virtually impossible once they had focused their attention on a specific group. Berserker Queen Freya asked the question I had been dreading. What would happen if we simply refused to cooperate with the Conclave's demands? The librarian's response was grimly matter-of-fact. Groups that defied the Conclave were typically hunted down by specialized enforcement teams equipped with reality-altering weapons that made conventional combat meaningless. The golden-armored paladin Arya sought information about diplomatic protocols and negotiation strategies that might improve our chances of a favorable outcome. The librarian provided detailed guidance on conclave etiquette and the formal procedures governing their evaluation process, information that could prove crucial if we decided to accept their invitation. As our consultation with the archive continued, it became clear that we had stumbled into a situation far more complex and dangerous than any of us had initially realized. The supernatural community operated under laws and treaties that had been established over millennia, and our accidental summoning had placed us squarely in violation of several major interdimensional agreements. However, the librarian also provided some encouraging news. Our group's composition and abilities were highly unusual, combining elements from multiple dimensional traditions in ways that had never been attempted before. This uniqueness might work in our favor, as the Conclave had historically shown interest in preserving rare or innovative supernatural phenomena for study and potential future applications. Elena asked about preparation strategies that might help us present ourselves in the best possible light during any formal evaluation. The librarian suggested that demonstrating our commitment to dimensional stability and our willingness to accept reasonable oversight would be crucial factors in determining the Conclave's response to our situation. The communication session lasted for several hours, during which we learned more about interdimensional politics and supernatural law than I had ever imagined existed. When the crystal finally dimmed and the librarian's image faded away, we were left with a wealth of information, but an even clearer understanding of the challenges we faced. Commander Serafina immediately called for another strategy meeting, but this time our discussion was informed by concrete intelligence rather than speculation and guesswork. The information from the archive had given us the tools we needed to make an informed decision about our response to the Conclave's invitation. The debate that followed was intense but focused, as each warrior contributed their expertise to analyzing our options in light of what we had learned. The romantic fantasy of operating as an independent supernatural organization was fading, replaced by the pragmatic reality of interdimensional politics and the need for legitimate recognition within the established order. Captain Lyra argued that the intelligence we had gathered confirmed her initial instincts about proceeding cautiously. The Conclave's enforcement capabilities were too formidable to challenge directly, and our best hope lay in convincing them that we pose no threat to dimensional stability while demonstrating our potential value as allies. Mistress Nyx took a more cynical view, suggesting that the Conclave's interest in our unique composition might lead them to attempt forced recruitment regardless of our cooperation. Her knowledge of void magic gave her insights into the darker aspects of interdimensional law that made her skeptical of any promises of fair treatment. Berserker Queen Freya remained convinced that showing strength and independence would earn more respect than appearing as supplicants seeking permission to exist. Her warrior culture emphasized the importance of facing challenges head-on, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Sage. Elena approached the problem from an academic perspective, analyzing the historical precedents the librarian had provided to identify patterns that might guide our decision-making. Her research suggested that groups with strong internal organization and clear leadership structures tended to fare better in conclave evaluations. The golden-armored paladin Arya focused on the diplomatic aspects of our situation, developing strategies for presenting our case in the most favorable light possible. Her experience with formal negotiations would be invaluable if we decided to accept the Conclave's invitation and attempt to work within their system. Shadow Master Kira remained characteristically quiet during most of the discussion, but when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had spent years surviving in hostile environments. She pointed out that regardless of what decision we made about the conclave, we needed to be prepared for the possibility that other entities might view our situation as an opportunity to advance their own agendas. Her warning proved prophetic when, just as our strategy session was reaching its conclusion, the house's defensive wards began screaming alerts about multiple approaching threats. Through the windows, we could see figures materializing at various points around the property. Not the single emissary we had dealt with before, but what appeared to be representatives from several different supernatural factions. Commander Serafina immediately shifted into combat mode, issuing orders that transformed our planning session into a tactical briefing. Whatever decision we made about the Twilight Conclave would have to wait, because it seemed that word of our unique situation had spread throughout the supernatural community, and everyone wanted to get a closer look at the group that had accidentally triggered reality-threatening alerts. The figures surrounding our property weren't moving to attack, but their positioning suggested they were prepared for violence if negotiations failed to achieve their objectives. Each group appeared to represent a different faction within the supernatural community, and their simultaneous arrival indicated a level of coordination that suggested this confrontation had been planned in advance. Mistress Nyx identified several of the approaching entities through her scrying abilities, reporting that we were facing representatives from at least 4 major dimensional powers, each with their own agenda and objectives regarding our situation. The political implications of this multi-faction interest were staggering, as it meant our group had become a prize that multiple powers were competing to claim or control. Captain Lyra took position at her chosen sniper point, reporting that the various factions were maintaining careful distances from each other, as well as from our defensive perimeter. This suggested that while they might be coordinating their approach to us, they were also prepared for conflict with each other if negotiations broke down. So there I was, surrounded by supernatural factions who all wanted a piece of my accidentally summoned army, with the Twilight Conclave breathing down my neck and reality itself apparently hanging in the balance. What started as a lonely college dropout spilling demon blood in his grandfather's basement had somehow escalated into interdimensional politics that could reshape the supernatural world. My waifu army wasn't just a dream come true anymore. It was the catalyst for events that none of us could have predicted. The next chapter of our story is going to be absolutely insane, and I can't wait to see where this crazy journey takes us next.